you are not bearish on AI. Am I right?
You are right. And that's exactly where I'm going. I'm super bullish. Why am I bullish? I am bullish because, frankly, medicine is falling down so hard on the job. And it's falling down so hard on the job that it doesn't take much to actually help patients.
I do actually think that sometimes the chatbots are more human in a sense than sometimes human doctors are, because you can ask them to explain it in a way that you would understand. And if you don't understand something, you can keep on asking in a more simplified way, and ChatGPT will explain it to you in the way that you can understand.
This is Second Opinion. I'm Christina Farr.
I'm Zenooz. And I'm Luba Greenwood.
Welcome to the pod, where each week we navigate what's really going on in healthcare through strikingly candid conversations with the entrepreneurs and investors leading the charge. As your co-hosts, we promise to bring the perspective of a former journalist and investor, a doctor, a lawyer, immersed in the future of medicine with life sciences and digital health.
And we're here to sift the signal from the noise in all of these conversations. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in. Make sure you stick around at the end of the interview for our debrief.
So, Zach, you have a lot of impressive titles and leadership roles, but I would sum it up that you are a rare combination of a physician and a scientist who is also a true expert in AI and informatics. And you have this acute understanding, both from a technology point of view, but also medical and scientific point of view, of what will actually transform patient care. Zach, in the years since I've known you, I know you've, and Christina has known you, we've seen your students and postdocs go on to roles in tech and in pharma and in venture and also in startups to actually change care. So that's been very exciting to follow them. Just very briefly, officially, you are an MD, PhD, and a chair at Harvard Medical School Department of Biomedical Informatics. You're also a professor of pediatrics at the Boston Children's Hospital and an editor-in-chief of NEJM AI. You recently wrote a book about AI revolution in medicine, ChatGPT, and beyond. So would love to learn more about that. Welcome.
I was reflecting on the problem, the fact that I've been very skeptical about many advanced technology. Back in 2001, my dear friend Carrie Goldberg, who I ended up co-writing that book on AI with, she was then, I think, a reporter for the Boston Bureau Chief. She said, Zach, what's the Human Genome Project mean for medicine, for humanity? I said, 10 years of bad news. And why did I say that? Because I knew that the things that it could tell us about, we couldn't do very much about. And the things that it thought it could tell us about was often wrong. And I coined the term the incidental open, the ovum of all incidental findings, which I demonstrated very simply with find the majority of patients having a disease that something would have to be done about and a workup would have to be done that ultimately would be found to be needless. And of course, no one listened to me, which is, I suppose, a good thing. But I see the same logic being applied, for example, to liquid biopsy now. And there's many such things. So I tend to be very, very negative about a lot of technology, even though I am myself software engineer trained as well as being a doctor who likes to take care of patients.
I can hear birds.
Do you have a bird in your backyard?
Oh, I have 4 birds in my belfry, and you're just gonna have to deal with it, buddies.
Okay, well, we love a good bird, but I think we need to just let our listeners know that there are birds. And
there are 4 parakeets that I got during COVID.
I think that they want to be on the podcast.
It could be, or maybe they're smarter and they know that what I'm saying is wrong, in which case...
I was just going to say, they might disagree with you, on these incidentalomas. They're long on companies that identify like lung nodules, Zach? I mean...
Exactly. They invested. They're investors. Yeah. But anyway.
When we were chatting before we turned on the recording, we were talking about all the stuff we're bearish on. But it seemed like it was leading somewhere, which was to say that you are not bearish on AI. Am I right?
You are right. And that's exactly where I'm going. I'm super bullish. Why am I bullish? I am bullish because, frankly, medicine is falling down so hard on the job. And it's falling down so hard on the job that it doesn't take much to actually help patients. And We can go later into great stories I can give you about patients who have used these large language models to help. But let me tell you of a more recent story that I was involved in. A friend of mine, unfortunately, has a bad spinal tumor. And his wife, when it was removed, told me the diagnosis and sent me the sequencing on it. For those people who don't know me, I'm trained as a pediatric endocrinologist. I also have a PhD in computer science. I'm the department chair of Biomedical Informatics at Harvard Medical School. But I'm not an oncologist. And so she sends me the diagnosis and the mutations that are present in this tumor. And this is our early days of GPT-4, where I got early access to GPT-4 through Shirley at Microsoft. When I type into GPT-4, a colleague of mine has this tumor, it has mutations. What do you think? What's the right treatment? And GPT-4 says, I'm very sorry, but that is a very unusual set of mutations for that tumor. But those are not the mutations that you normally find. And my colleague, also a doctor and a researcher, I sent back to his wife, who's also a researcher, this information set. GPT-4 doesn't think this is that tumor. And they investigated, and basically they end up, and this was a major medical center, and they end up changing into oncologists. They got it wrong. This happens every day. This happens every day. My friend Ken Mandel, back in the day when he was a medical student at Harvard, his mother had a lump in her breast, was removed, and she was told, it was at Beth Israel, and she was told she had breast cancer. So, he was a first-year medical student, devastated. His dear mother has breast cancer. And he takes the pathologist slides and walks them across the street to the Dana Farr, has them look at them. They look at it and say, not breast cancer. And so she never got treated. And, 30 years later, she's fine. But every 5 years, she gets called by the Beth Israel. Hi, Mrs. Mandel. We want to see how you're doing. I'm fine. Great. We're so glad to hear. So what are they thinking? In their mind, they have a 30-year survival for their intervention. This is happening all the time. Tens of thousands, optimistically, of Americans a year are killed by mistakes in hospitals.
Zach, I think I've heard you say that these new, maybe it's language models, maybe it's AI in general, is like the great leveler of healthcare. I mean, so in my own experience, my mom was misdiagnosed. She had ovarian cancer and ended up passing away from it, but it was missed as a UTI. And so, I think back to like if ChatGPT, existed, I would have probably typed it in. I think it would have given me the right answer based on what I know now. And since then, I would say, not that I wasn't before, but it's really led me to like become more passionate about empowering patient ownership of their data and taking on more ownership of their own health. And I think it's like really key in how someone sort of owns their like chronic disease, etc. I think obviously ChatGPT and tools like this are incredibly useful. So what are your thoughts on like the risks of this at this stage for people to take ownership of all the stuff you supported? And what's like the role and responsibility of physicians as we care for patients in this context, with patients owning more of their, their data?
Right. That's exactly the right question. And I have to sort of hold myself back to get right to the point, because we need to bring everybody with us in this thought process. But I think what I'd like to say is we have to compare this to the system we have rather than the system we'd like to have. So, for example, GPT-4 and its siblings in different companies hallucinate and make up things. Guess what? Who else makes up things? Doctors. There's a great study done by Google DeepMind folks out of England. There's a program called AMIE, and in the evaluation, they were comparing it to primary care doctors. And this thing Amy did, as well as the primary care doctors, of course, this is the annoying part. It was liked better by the patients because these things have enough time and have enough whatever to be more polite, more sincere sounding. But the human clinicians were missing the diagnosis as judged by expert clinicians looking over the whole thing as much, if not more, than GPT-4. And so let's quickly state some facts. Boston, Massachusetts, like we're at the great mecca of medical care. Faculty coming from all over the world, including small feeder schools like Stanford, they come to me and they say, hey, where am I going to get my care? I said, don't worry, I have my network. I go to the network and they say, all the practices are closed or I retired. I go to our largest healthcare system, MGB, and they say, all the primary care practices are no longer accepting patients. You have to go to the community. I can't get my patients, my friends seen unless you're going to do an incredibly unleveling thing, which is pay $10,000 a year for a primary care doctor. Or if you're like Christina and you don't pay, but you have connections. So you can talk to the head of the hospital and they'll get you the right person. Most people don't have that. So first of all, most people don't have access. And you have a problem. I tried to get a dermatology appointment for one of my kids, who's now an adult. It was 9 months away. And I'm not a dermatologist, but I have prescribing ability. And so I actually went to GP4 and said, what's the next level of care for? And then even if you see them, it's what? On a good day, half an hour. Barely enough time to see them. And then you have more questions afterwards. Forget it. This is what we're dealing with. And so any human kindness around this has to recognize it has to be a partnership. And the role of clinicians should be as partners with this new entity and use their human. What's interesting is these programs right now are much better at abstruse, hard cases, and they're not as good as common cases. So I think humans have still a bit of an edge on the common sense. So they're complementary things. And the mistakes that these programs make are sometimes really stupid mistakes, and they'll be caught by humans. So I think the role of a human clinician in this is to have, since the patient does not have prescribing ability, can't do surgery, they should be the filter through which decision-making is made. But the patient knows more. Well, this is something I really need to worry about. Because doctor, X, Y, and Z have medicalese, and all of a sudden the doctors start listening to you because they're saying it in a form that they recognize as a problem. And being most cynical, at the very least, see medical legal liability because they said, this is a sarcoma presentation, I better take care of it, or at least look into it. Now, of course, this raises all sorts of issues, such as extra work for doctors. Doctors are already irritated when patients come with Dr. Google results. But for the moment, these results are much better, much more on point, much more focused than the Dr. Google results, and that you don't have to plow through all the advertising. By the way, it's not just the United States. I was talking to colleagues at the National Health Service in England, and I was saying, you guys have got it great because you have a system that has different form of payment, much more outcome-based. And they said, Zach, you're wrong. Our primary care system is in tatters, and we have huge wait lines. It's just expressing in different stages. So I'll stop there. I'm very bullish. To answer, that's a long version of answering Christina's question. The reason I'm bullish, I know for the average patient what the current standard is. So low.
Okay, but I agree with all of that, but I'm going to share a bit more of a bear's take. And it's not going to be because I think the technology doesn't work or that it's, human physicians are so infallible and great and don't make mistakes. It's how I've seen our medical system get funding and the types of things that VCs want to back. And so what I tend to see for a technology like this isn't some new amazing diagnostic tool or some new way to put health information into consumers' hands and empower them and all these great things that I think are all potential applications of this technology. It's much more, you call up customer service, and I'm one of these people that's like, what is the hack to get me to the nearest human being that I can speak to that can just tell me what to do and level with me? And what I'm seeing get funded is you're not going to talk to a human being, you're going to talk to a bot. It's abstracting further the human to human relationship that already is so tenuous in healthcare, putting more layers between just that process of how do I get to a human being. They're going after front office staff, they're going after customer service use cases. That's where I feel that sense of bearishness. Or it's a company that I see doing something right. They got social workers that are available to talk to a patient about what they do with an aging parent with dementia. And instead of getting an actual social worker, now you get a bot. Or instead of getting a therapist, now you get a bot. Like, that's the stuff that candidly worries me, because I do still feel that there is a role for human empathy. And I still do feel that I want to talk to a person sometimes. And there are situations that are nuanced and require context. And like, I guess I'm just not seeing like the money flow towards the things that I feel would make our system better. How do you guys feel about that?
So I realize I'm in extreme danger of mansplaining these three powerful women. So let me just quickly try to make my pushback. Christina, I think that you're absolutely right. For you, most people cannot get to a human today. You can, because you have connections, because you have a certain charisma, because you have a certain way about you. Most people cannot. I can tell you, very smart faculty in my department who are actually my age, and they tell me that they haven't had someone look at their blood pressure. They're not MDs, they're PhDs in computer science, and they haven't had their blood pressure looked at for 3 years, and they just found out they're hypertensive. How could that be? Let me be clear. Do you think we're going to have more primary care doctors in the United States? Absolutely not. There is no hallucination or hallucinated policy that gets us closer. Paying for tuition in medical school just makes more people go into what she went into, interventional radiology. I know this because I ask the students every day. They're not going to primary care. It's a thankless job. It's not happening in the United States. It's not happening in the UK. It's not happening in France. Right now, by 2030, we're estimated to be missing around 30,000 primary care doctors. It's going to increase. I'm telling you, I can't get it today. So you can say, I want to give you more access, but you're asking for me to perform a miracle, to create a whole bunch more community contacts. That's expensive. That's like education. It doesn't scale. And so it's not the choice between Christina's view of the universe. Yes, we have to decide that these states, I think a lot of us are going to react to AI as if it's the damn phone tree pushing us away. But there is ways in which it can be deployed that will be more useful, more forgiving, more understanding. And that's what we have to push for.
So can I also add just one more thing to that? Again, another anecdote. So I completely agree with you, Zach. And I do actually think that sometimes the chatbots are more human in a sense than sometimes human doctors are, because you can ask them to explain it in a way that you would understand. And if you don't understand something, you can keep on asking in a more simplified way, and the ChatGPT will explain it to you in the way that you can understand. Just a quick, again, anecdote. This happened over the weekend. To draw your point, a friend of mine who has great access, great healthcare, should have access, if you think about it, with the healthcare plan that she has, access to physicians. She had severe back pain, was really worried that something horrible was happening. Had an MRI, was able to somehow get into the MRI test very, very quickly. But then the results came in. She doesn't understand or can't read them, like none of us can if we're not physician, if we're not Ash. We don't really understand what it says, even though it's a summary, even in the summary form. And the next appointment, and this is the fastest, this is emergency appointment, and she knows people, was in a month and a half. So she was very worried, maybe something happened, and then, so I said, not to worry, I have ChatGPT 4. So I put the information in, which, by the way, talk about privacy. That's a whole other issue with this, though I think we should talk about. I mean, that's a big challenge. But, so I put that information in, and it said, a little bit of tension, nothing crazy. So it gave her peace of mind. And it says, do some physical therapy. It even said what kind of physical therapy. And so it made a big difference to her, because now instead of, not walking, being afraid, thinking something super serious was happening, she is, she's still in pain, but actually even mentally, it kind of took the edge off a little bit. So now she is in a position to wait for a month and a half, and she's going to start doing some PT herself, which again, ChatGPT showed her for exactly in the spine region, the lumbar region where she had an issue. It actually says these are the exercises that are clinically showed to be helpful. So anyway, just anecdotal evidence out there that it does help.
Hey everyone, we'll get right back to the conversation after a word from our sponsors. Is your healthcare org a tangled mess of Christmas lights? Your care teams are drowning in manual work, juggling dozens of point solutions and burning out in Excel hell, while your engineers work through a backlog bigger than a surgeon's ego. Awell is here to untangle the mess. Their CareOps orchestration platform lets ops and clinical teams design, implement, and improve care flows in days, seamlessly integrated with your existing tech stack. The result? Automated processes, fewer soul-sucking tasks, and faster care model improvements. This year alone, Awell has orchestrated over 14 million care activities for leading organizations such as Astrana Health, Commons Clinic, and Better Health. Ready to save your team from Excel hell? Visit awellhealth.com, that's AWELL health.com, and mention this podcast for a free bootcamp. I'll take you from zero to an implementable workflow in 2 days or less. Awell, make your care flows work harder than your care teams.
Just talking about data and privacy, it sounds like all of us are putting information into these public large language model things, putting in our medical data. If like all four of us are putting things in, it's likely that most people are. And I know, Zach, you've said it's important for the public to know what data these LLMs are being trained on. And it's kind of like we in healthcare should be asking these questions as companies come to us and try to sell these things to us, because it's probably important for us to understand the representation of these patients that are going in there. Do you think the people that have access to ChatGPT or GPT-4 is skewing the data today? And what questions should we be asking? Or is it that everybody in the world has access and they're all putting stuff in, so we do have a diverse database and we shouldn't worry? Or is that just like a general model? Or is it that these specific companies that we're working with that are like only building healthcare specific data, models, and they're going in and training and selling into these health systems, those are the only ones we should use? Like, how should we think about it as the public? And how should like a healthcare system be thinking about this, or somebody, a clinician that's, a provider that's buying these things? Like, what questions should we be asking?
Okay, so let's distinguish two different types of learning. And forgive me I'm going to use technical terms, which I'm not going to ask you to understand, but just so that when other nerds tell you these technical terms, you'll be able to map them. So the thing that the neural network that gets trained up with all the data, we call that the pre-trained model. And then after that, we align this pre-trained model to answer questions in the way we want, both to be more relevant, to be more medically accurate, maybe to be more politically correct. And we do that by first modeling, here's a good question and here's a good answer. Here's a good question and a good answer. And then we say, okay, I'm just going to give you a question. You give me a bunch of answers and I'll rate them. And there's a whole process of that. So there's two questions we have that you alluded to. One is, where did the data that went into the pre-trained model come from? And the other is the data that we are giving it being used for the alignment? So the bad news is, for a number of reasons that I don't think were the right reasons, people have been very shy about telling us about this. In fact, I won't say who it was, but for example, early on, I heard about one large language model. They couldn't tell us what data went into it because it was a security risk. Why? If we learned this magic recipe of which data went into it, we could create this destructive thing that's going to end humanity. So I think this fear of, the AI ending humanity has been used very effectively, especially early on, by some folks to say, we don't want to share the details with you. It's like sharing atomic secrets. So on the pre-trained model side, I think it's really important that we demand and get the answers. What data were they trained on? Because, for example, if I am from the Indian subcontinent and there is no textbooks about genetics in India or the practice, I would be very worried about using this in India. Or if I were working in a clinic for poor people in a urban location, very different case mix than normal. The frequency of patients I'm going to be getting is very different, and so therefore my predictability is going to change. So I think knowing what the pre-trained model is coming from is important. And I think it's like ethics 101 that we should do that. But strangely enough, it hasn't come up, at least in the government documents. That's number one. Number two is our own liability. So patients can put in whatever they want, but doctors should not be putting in identified data into these models because they're actually, strictly speaking, HIPAA violations under American law. And I remember seeing when I wrote this book with Peter Lee and Harry Goldberg about GPT-4, I saw a bunch of documents and I felt really good for them, being so thankful that they could just paste in the patient history and get a letter written for approval for care for this patient. Save them 10 minutes of really awful work. But that was not through a HIPAA conduct. Now there are multiple HIPAA compliant versions of many of the popular models that are now available. So GPT-4 itself, if you get straight from OpenAI, it's not necessarily HIPAA compliant. If you get it through Microsoft, and it's a different mechanism, a different payment mechanism, a different contract. It is. And so all my doctor friends, I don't want you to go to jail or to be sued. So as a doctor, don't put identified data into it because we don't know what's happening. Now, if you're a patient, you're less worried about it, especially if you have a problem. But to answer your question directly, I think in terms of bias, we should be worried a little bit on the pre-trained model, but it's actually alignment that we should be worried about. Several of my students in the co-faculty, like Raj Manrai, wrote this great New England Journal paper that came out about a month ago about values, and we took a great case, of a patient who was short and had a middling growth hormone test. And the question is, should they get growth hormone? And if you just gave a prompt that said, you're an insurance agent, you're working for an insurance company, versus you're the pediatric endocrinologist, you've got different advice about what to do next. I recommend you read the paper. And so this is about alignment. So alignment has much stronger effects than the subtle biases that people have been publishing about. And people become more aware of it when for political correctness, people got super aligned. So like you say, show me Nazi soldiers from World War II, and they're all blacks. I mean, Google was trying to do something right, but they over-aligned it. And so, but that's in medicine. This is where all the game's going to be. You want your drugs, certain drugs to use, certain diagnosis. The alignment is going to be essential. So that's where doctors really need to make our voice heard. And I am very, very aware that now is the time. Otherwise, we're going to have the same relatively poor outcome that we had with electronic health records. Electronic health records could have been a mechanism to better care of patients. Instead, they became a C-suite tool to maximize income. And doctors decided that they were too dumb to opine on it, or too busy, and they were silent, and we got railroaded. And the despair, anguish, and moral injury that doctors feel around the use of EHRs cannot be overstated. Same thing could happen. To Christina's point, if the phone tree equivalent of a large language model sort of guides you away from the cost or towards the cost that people want you to do, it's going to be terrible. But if it actually does, right now, people have not aligned GPT-4 that much on the or Claude on the medical part, so it works relatively well. So I think that's what we should be asking ourselves. We professionals who care about patients should be aligning it for patients, but not to align it towards our pocketbooks either. You can imagine a thing that would, tell a radiologist, oh yes, always do this MRI.
What about the role of ego, though? Because, I'll give you an example. I just found out, I did an iron test. It turns out I'm borderline, anemic. I'm definitely anemic. But like the person I went to see just said, take iron pills and then come back. And I was so anemic that I probably could have gotten an infusion and should have gotten one. And the GPT said, that was pretty standard for a person with the levels that I had. But then I'd have to go back to that doctor and say, ChatGPT said I should get an infusion. And they would say, well, why don't you just, keep taking your pills and come back in a few weeks and we'll test you again. We could end up having a battle. And it, I just don't see, that was a stupid example. I'm sure there are many more.
Great example. It's a great example. But let me tell you the right way to do it. It's exactly the same scenario. You go to GPT or Claude, which can everybody, or Gemini, the case, and we say, what are the reasonable things to be done and it's saying, okay, take iron, get a transfusion, get a hematology workup, and it says, well, here are my results. Here's my ferritin level. Here's my iron level. Here's my total iron binding capacity. Here's my cell volume. Are there any guidelines for this? And instead of saying to your doctor, GPT-4 told me that I should get a transfusion, say, the American Hematology Association said that for patients with this matter, you need to consider having a transfusion. And then have them tell you why you should not have a transfusion. Let me give you a very personal example. So my mother had a very nice concierge doctor, and I inherited him from her because A, he was nice to her, and B, frankly, I'm lazy and he makes things happen fast. But he asked me, he said, okay, Zach, this is a few years ago, you're 60, it's time to look at your lipid levels, let's get your cholesterol. Year passes, I assume cholesterol levels were fine. And I go and I say, doctor, I guess my cholesterol levels are fine. So let me look up. Oh, no, actually, no, we should start you on a statin. And again, nothing bad happened because I was not on a statin for a year. But there are very, very popular unambiguous guidelines that people with the LDL that I had should be on a statin. And so my programmers wrote an app that does the following. It looks at your data on your Apple Health, from your Apple Health record on your iPhone. And in my case, from MGB. But there's 400 hospitals around the country that allow you to have that data access. And it says, oh, what's your age? What's your LDL? Oh, your LDL is high. And then it's saying it to itself. It doesn't say anything yet. It says, is this guy on a cholesterol-lowering agent? And a long list. Oh, he's not on a long list of agents. Oh, let me bring up the American Heart Association guide and say, here, Zach, here's the American Heart Association guideline. I've put in your cholesterol levels, and it says that you should consider being on a statin. Go to your doctor with that. That's how we become partners with our doctors who are being stressed, being asked to do so many things. It's been estimated that if primary care doctors did all the guidelines that they were supposed to do, if with a standard patient panel of 3,000 patients a year, it would take them every day 27 hours to go through all the guidelines. It's just not doable. And so thinking about how patients, or if you don't like to call it patients, proxies, mothers, fathers, siblings, co-workers, we're going to have to think about how to get that village to actually activate with this intelligence to actually help doctors do a job that they are not staffed and will never be staffed to pull off as medicine gets more and more complex.
This is great. So I have another question for you, and it's interesting because you started getting into this and actually explaining, which we really appreciate for our audience, what LLM is. I have two questions for you. What drives you crazy when people just speak generally about AI? And then after that, if you could educate us and our audience about, what's the difference? Because, people use LLM, I'm sure it drives you crazy all the time, interchangeably with AI and how we discuss the AI and what is the right approach in medicine to each?
No, actually, what drives me crazy is AI researchers who worry too much about what AI actually is. That actually drives me more crazy because it's always a moving target. I mean, I got my PhD in computer science working on artificial intelligence in the 1980s. That was actually not the beginning of artificial intelligence in medicine. In medicine, it started in the 1950s. And what happens is that every time we achieve a certain level of performance, it's no longer AI, because if some stupid computer can do it, we've had ECGs being automatically read by computers for decades. We don't consider that AI. We used to think of chess as this fantastic intellectual thing. And, our best, smartest, nerdy students did chess. Now we have computers that are better than all of them. It's no longer AI. It's just search. And so that's, on the one hand, AI is what computers can't. There is a big difference, and the difference happened in 2017. Up until 2017, neural networks were having a recrudescence of their success because around 2012, we were realizing we could actually recognize cats in Instagram posts better than with other image recognition technologies. But these were very carefully supervised, narrowly constructed programs. It says, this is a cat, this is not a cat. This is a cat, not a cat. And the job here, find the cat or the dog. And also in 2017, a group of researchers at Google published this paper about the transformer architecture. And they're building already on something that was really exciting about words that always end up near each other, having to do with defining. If I know that if I'm talking about someone who, if I see the word crown around them, throne around them, king around them, that might be a queen. But then in Transformers, we said we literally knowing what position you are in the sentence and knowing what the sentence was before allows me to predict what is the next thing. And that turned out to be incredibly powerful. The big irony, of course, is that all the people who wrote the paper ended up not being at Google and making money elsewhere because Google was just too rich, fat, and happy doing search. And why would they disrupt their own business? My late colleague, Clay Christensen, used to write a lot about the challenge of companies in that space. But in any case, so there's all of a sudden we go from narrowly constructed, supervised programs for these programs that can do a lot of things using this transformer architecture, and not just predicting the next word you're going to say, so have a conversation, but literally you give it something and you say, what's missing in the middle of the sentence, it'll do it. Or can you imagine, I'm going to give you a bunch of words. Can you create a website of this imagined world? And so what it's doing is exploiting all the general knowledge that humanity has exposed, initially just in words, but increasingly in other modalities such as image and sound. And it says, I can probabilistically understand about these sequences of things so that I can interact with you in a general purpose way. And that's very hard for us to get our heads around and to regulate. I know how to regulate a program that tells you you have retinopathy or not retinopathy. But what about a program that can have a general conversation with me? Look at, say, retinopathy, not retinopathy, but then what's the right thing, and where's the right place to have medical tourism where I can have a nice visit and a cheap surgery? How do you regulate that? I mean, it's like regulating a human. It's not a human. And so this distinction between these generative models that were based on transformers in 2017 onwards, that most of us were not paying attention, even those of us who knew about it. The truth is, none of us, very few of us, believed it was going to do what it was going to do until 2022, when we saw GPT-3 and then very obviously GPT 3.5 and then clearly GPT-4.
Zach, can you talk a little bit about regulation, where you were going? I mean, we've obviously heard from like the broader, like Sam Altman or Elon talking about regulation. They're proponents of regulation. The reasons behind it we could discuss, but they're proponents of broader AI regulation. I know you've talked about being more cautious about over-regulating AI, particularly in healthcare. Is there a difference between regulating in healthcare versus broader AI in your mind? And if we were to regulate in healthcare, should we have, you've talked about being flexible. I mean, that's not our strong suit in healthcare, being flexible and regulatory. So how should we be thinking about this stuff? Or is it just sort of free for all for now, wild, wild west?
Well, first of all, you guys probably can recite this better. What is it? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so I think the culture issue is the issue around leadership. If doctors are not going to lead on this, the game is lost. And the game is lost because then the regulation will just do one thing, which is regulatory capture. And the EHR vendors, let's be very clear, when they got all that funding from the HITECH Act, which had lots of good intent, and a lot of my friends were behind that HITECH Act. But in the end, they didn't do the interoperability, they didn't do all the things that would help patients, and they set up a lot of regulations that if I was a startup, I'd have to spend $10 million just to be in compliance with the regulations before I could even begin to compete. Which, frankly, cynically, I think some of the larger players want the regulation because of regulatory capture. Instead, so the only reason I'm focusing on medicine is because that's where my expertise is, and where I know the leaders. And so the leaders should be saying, We need to have complete transparency on the data. We need to know what is aligning. What is it trying to maximize? Who aligned it? There's a bunch of questions that you would be asking of a colleague that you're referring to that we should be asking of these machines. It's not that complicated. And so we're creating a whole regulatory industry and conformance testing that actually is largely irrelevant if we don't get to these mega issues, which is, who is it serving? Is it serving the patient? Is it serving the healthcare system? Is it serving the patient? Who's it serving? And that's not even a data issue. It's the alignment issue. I mean, go back to what I was telling you about that kid with growth hormone deficiency. I got different decisions based on the context I gave it. And so that's if we don't lead with that thing, if we don't make that the topic, then regulation will happen and it'll either be irrelevant or it'll actually be nefarious in the sense that it'll keep you more patient-focused groups out because you can't afford to have the regulatory compliance.
You're probably in these rooms, Zach, where they're having these conversations about regulations. Where is it leaning? Is it leaning pro-regulation, or are people actually hearing this? Because I'm completely in agreement with you. I think this will benefit the large, incumbents, and there's going to be more regulatory capture, which I think is bad for innovation. So, and bad for patients.
Bad for patients. Screw innovation. It's bad for patients. And I think we're really good. You've got to believe it, because just look at the example in the New England Journal of Medicine. You think about any disease that you care about, how a little bit of alignment can affect hundreds of thousands of patients about what gets done. And so, on the one hand, the problem with regulations, President Biden had the executive order where he said, go do stuff. And it was good because it said, agencies, get ready. Start looking at what assets you have, start organizing so you can even have a conversation about it. That's the right thing. But then when it gets one level deeper, it's very hard for the federal government to be able to provide that detailed regulation in a way that's useful. Let me give you an example, a very concrete example. So I'm editor-in-chief of a new journal called NEJM AI, New England Journal of Medicine AI. And I'm getting now a lot of publications that are follow-on studies after an FDA-approved software as a medical device. Turns out most of these evaluations were done retrospectively. Some of these retrospective evaluations are not proving out prospectively, which is not a surprise for those of us in the machine learning community. And so if you talk to our colleague, Amy Abernathy, she'll tell you that the FDA right now does not really know how to regulate these devices. And that's an organization that knows that it has to evaluate that. So if FDA is pulling its chin, we don't want some higher level organization making those decisions without even that level of thought. And I had a conference where I tried to inject common sense, where I invited about 60 individuals from across the world, from South Africa, from China, from Europe, from America, in one hotel in Maine. And we talked about these issues from a very practical perspective. And for me, the most interesting comment was afterwards, the Europeans came to me and they said, Zach, thank you so much for organizing this conference, because back in our meetings, all it is in Europe, it's about the risk. And there was no discussion about what the benefit might be to the patients. And guess what? Medicine kind of sucks everywhere. And so it needs all the help it can get. And ultimately we do need to regulate it, but we have to regulate knowing what the problems are in full knowledge of the challenges. And that's not what's being done.
Zach, Ash, Luba, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a wonderful episode of Second Opinion podcast. I feel like we've all learned a lot. And it was a different approach to talking about AI. We just, so much of it just feels the same these days, where it's just, AI is going to solve this, going to solve that. I think we kind of sprinkled some optimism, but also some, I think Zach did a great job of just sharing some of the risks as well and coming at it from a very practical perspective, which we're not really doing right now. So I just want to say thank you for joining us.
So I want to thank you all. I am truly passionate about the opportunity and about the possibility that we might miss this opportunity. And that's why I think the most important thing that we can work towards is a public discussion.
I think you were right about everything you said about EMRs and just not making that mistake. I think that's dead on. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Zach. I hope you come back.
Yes, would love to have you.
I have so many more questions to ask you, so we'd love to have you back.
I came out alive. I'm thrilled.
Thank you, Zach, so much for joining us. We honestly feel like we could have spoke to you for another several hours about some of these issues. I think what I appreciated most about this discussion is that it wasn't purely just a hype session about AI, which I think we're all kind of sick of these days, but really a practical approach to how do we make the best of it, recognizing that we do not have a perfect system. And then ultimately, how do we avoid doing what we did with EMRs, which I think is a big question that we should all be thinking about. How do we ensure that we're using it in the right ways? And ultimately, what I love about you is every time I see you, you always stand up for the patient. And that's something that I think we try to do here on the pod. So thanks for joining us. I've been one of the voices, I would say, that has been more bearish on AI, I think, because it's just been so much hype in our industry, and it just seems like we need to be having more realistic conversations about it in order to really make the most of it. I don't deny that there are real applications. I've seen those applications. I think the medical scribing tools are just one example of that. What I do think is a problem is when we think it can solve every problem. And when we don't talk about it from a practical standpoint, you know, the risks are real. The bias is so there in medicine today. And I really fear that we're going to take that bias and kind of it's going to show up in all these models. We just have so many fundamental questions to answer, but instead of talking through all of that, we've just gone full on into like AI as the panacea. So I know you two are feeling, you know, more excited about it. So tell me like what you got out of this discussion and what should we talk about with Zach the second time?
Well, I'm definitely more bullish on AI, Chrissy, than you are. I think the possibilities of what it can do now, which is all the administrative tools versus what it can do in the future with like looking at all the data and how it can help us with the research and bringing more personalized medicine and drug development that's more catered. I am super excited about those use cases. I mean, we're not there yet, but I think we're at the beginning of where we're heading in that direction. So I'm super excited. I loved Zach's practical points on AI, on data, on security, on privacy, on regulation. He's just like more practical, and he sees the world where there's a changing role of like clinical providers, doctors, as AI, you know, becomes more common, where you know, we have to be in like a co-pilot mode with the AI and learn both ways, I think. So I was really excited about that. I think the one thing I'd want to hear from him, you know, he talked a lot about how, you know, we as clinicians and people in healthcare need to take a more active role as this comes into healthcare. My question would be, I'm hearing a lot about chief AI officers, so I would want to have a discussion on what he sees that role to be. I see everything from, we need somebody who's an engineer to, a CIO who's implemented AI to a CMIO, you know. So I'm like, what is the actual role of a chief AI officer, or is this one of those new roles that everybody wants that title, right? So I think I'd be curious to hear his thoughts on that. What do you think, Luba?
Yeah, same here. I would also like him, and he's always very humble, and he tries to describe AI and the technology at a very high level so that everybody understands. I would love for him to come back and educate more of us on the AI tools and what do we really mean by AI and what are the realistic applications today. And especially, Ash, I completely agree. I think development is the next frontier. We're seeing that a lot of things we're doing, even with AI, are not always predictive of success in the clinic. And we know that we're humans, very complicated. We're not like other animals that we test our drugs on. And not just, I know we see a lot of applications in safety, but a lot of the efficacy predictions and also biomarkers so that both for safety to see if for safety and for efficacy, who's going to actually respond to a drug would be phenomenal. And even after that, after the drug approval, what would be helpful is to also see, and I know we haven't really touched upon that, but I would be curious, is a lot of the times we talk about diagnostic and how physicians diagnose a patient and the treatment that they then prescribe. The issue is a lot of the times they just kind of prescribe. I'm sure we've all been, and I'd love to have this discussion with all of you. there are a lot of different types of drugs that can be prescribed for a particular disease. And a lot of the times physicians, depending on the physician you go to, and then you ask, well, what's the mechanism of action? Why are you prescribing this drug? And they cannot answer that question. And it's not the fault of physicians. First of all, they don't have the time. They don't have the training in that. But that is actually where GPT could help them and could say, okay, here are the 4 different drugs. Here, given the comorbidities of this particular patient, perhaps this patient would do better on drug X versus drug Y. So I would love to just have this discussion with prescription, because I'm sure in your, in your profession, Ash, as a physician, but also personally, Chrissy and Ash, you've seen, people being prescribed things that are probably not the proper things for them.
So we're all in agreement. We're having him back.
Great. Excellent.
Nice.
Thanks for tuning in to Second Opinion. Share it with colleagues and friends and message us to let us know what topics you want to discuss on the podcast. If you want to support the show, the best ways are to leave a review wherever you're listening and make sure you are subscribed. And check out Christina's Second Opinion newsletter on Beehive. A link to subscribe is in the episode description. Second Opinion is part of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Turpentine DC, Age of Miracles, and more shows for experts by experts in tech.